live here. So here we go. So it's running live on YouTube, by the way.
Super.
Hi, everyone. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And I am here with Rob. And Rob is a formerly, I shouldn't say formerly Jewish, but is a Jewish person who was raised in a Jewish family in a very Jewish area in Connecticut who has come to Jesus. And so it's so exciting. I actually kind of imitated the title that I'd heard from a Muslim one time. He said, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. That was Nabil Qureshi. And so I called this Seeking Yahweh, Finding Jesus. And so how did this happen? And I'm telling you guys, I'm going in here blind. I don't know how Rob came to Christianity, or just I guess maybe call yourself a Jew for Jesus. So I don't know how that all happened. So we're going to learn some pretty interesting stuff. And he's in the process of writing a book. And so we're going to learn about that too. So without further ado, let me introduce Rob.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be with you today. I think we're going to enjoy it, and thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, you're welcome. So how did this all happen? Or can you tell us how you were raised and how it all sort of came about, this idea that now you endorse and believe in Jesus?
Well, there are so many facets to it that I'll try to start with the outer part of the onion, and maybe we'll peel away a little bit. I grew up in an extremely Jewish area. You know, it's funny when people hear that I grew up in a Jewish area, West Hartford, Connecticut, they might get the idea that that means that many of us were observantly Jewish. That really wasn't the case. Most of us were more Jewish by identity and ethnicity rather than by observance. But yet, Jewishness was a key part of our identity, both for me, both personally, both with my family, my extended family, and friends and the community around me. So my worldview was pretty much Jewish and Gentile. There was a Jewish world of which I was a part, and then there was the Gentile world beyond our area. And so I really saw things through a Jewish lens, but as I say, not religiously. We did observe the Passover, the Day of Atonement, the Rosh Hashanah, and occasionally went to synagogue on the Sabbath, especially for special occasions like a bar mitzvah. But interestingly enough, even though my parents weren't observant, they didn't keep kosher, although they would never let pork in the home. But they would have a spare rib in the Chinese restaurant, which was a dichotomy I still have never figured out, but not an uncommon situation in my level of Jewish observance where I was. But for me, a lot of my identity was as a Jewish person. I keenly knew that being Jewish was significant. It was something of a long tradition, something that had meant something as I mentioned, for a very long period of time. And so therefore, to consider doing or believing anything that was outside of that community was something, first of all, that was very a remote idea. As a matter of fact, even though I was seriously searching for truth in late high school and early college, of the many pursuits that I engaged in, whether it be transcendental meditation, whether it be yoga, whether it be various New Age and Eastern related movements and ideas, never once did I consider picking up a New Testament. I literally never thought of it. I mean, I would have picked up a copy of the Bhagavad Gita earlier than I would have picked up a New Testament. The New Testament was threatening to me and really represented to me a non-Jewish religion that had no meaning or purpose in my life. So I'll continue a little bit. Interestingly enough, the way that I encountered the New Testament was sort of through the back door. What I mean is, in my pursuits of Eastern religions and New Age philosophy, and all of these different disciplines that I was looking into, they all had something positive to say about Jesus. Of course, they would say that their take on Jesus was the right one, whereas Christianity was missing the mark, but that they saw Jesus as the way to peace or fulfillment or cosmic consciousness. In some way, they felt that Jesus represented their view. So often in their books or teachings, they would list verses from the New Testament, of course, explain it from their point of view, but it enabled me to encounter those verses for the first time. As a matter of fact, the first time I read a great deal of the New Testament, or many verses, was in a book that was as counter to New Testament gospel faith as could possibly be. It was called the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. This was a mystical, I'll even say a cult book based on New Age teachings. But of course, it used many verses from the New Testament, and Jesus is saying specifically that would comment on them, but many of them I had never heard in my life, and therefore they fit in with what I was going through, because they were talking about this path that was beyond our own self, that was beyond our own narrow interests. And it really captivated me and really caused me to gain more interest into who Jesus really was.
Yeah, that's really fascinating finding it that way, because I kind of took a similar path to you as far as sort of leaving. I grew up in the Catholic faith, but then I sort of left and I was looking at the New Age stuff like you. And you're right. It's interesting how everyone seems to understand that Jesus does bring peace, no matter what the religion is. So I see that. So this is a very interesting path that you've taken. So then what happened?
Well, one thing that was key was actually a movie. It was a movie called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. It was about the life of Francis of Assisi, called Saint Francis. But actually, when you watch the movie, it seemed odd that he would ever be sainted, because he really struck out against the Roman Church at that time. I think it was in the 12th century. And he rejected the opulence and the bureaucracy of the Roman Catholic Church, and actually restored a second century church and lived a very simple life and taught a very simple life. And that movie really captivated me, because many verses from the gospel were in that. And it was a real transition for me from this Eastern mystical New Age aspect that I was part of, towards more a sense of what the good news actually was and what this actual peace was that Jesus promised. So, as a matter of fact, I saw the movie 5 times that summer, and I brought a different person each time, whether it be my sister or my father or friends. And each time we would leave the theater and they would just look at me like, why did you bring me here? Like, what did you think? Although my sister did actually like the movie, and we'll still talk about it from time to time. But the other 4 were like, okay, you're into this, but we're not. I mean, for me, it was like, well, how could you not be? I mean, it was just striking this deep chord within me. So that summer, I continued to really engage in these other pursuits, but this movie was really percolating in my consciousness. I went to the University of Connecticut that fall, and I went to a meeting. There was a little blurb in the campus paper about a Christian meeting, and it was very nondescript and sort of generic looking. And I was like, Well, I want to find out more about Jesus. I'll go to this meeting. Well, it turned out to be a meeting of Campus Crusade for Christ. And during the meeting, the campus director said, who is who here would like to tell about his story or what's been going on with him or her this summer? So, being the non-shy person that I am, I raised my hand and I said, well, this summer I realized that Jesus is the person I want to become more like. Jesus is the person who I think holds ultimate meaning for my life. And I want to grow closer to him and walk more closely to him because I think that he is the answer to my life. Well, the campus director was amazed by this. He was thinking, perhaps this is a new, mature Christian who's going to be significantly part of our fellowship. So he actually met with me in the student union, really to find out more about me and challenge me to be part of the ministry. Well, of course, very soon after he met me and started talking to me, he realized I was coming from an entirely different place, that my wanting to be like Jesus or to know him more was coming from a totally Eastern mystical New Age point of view. And he realized he needed to share the good news with me. I had never heard it up to that point in my life. I had never heard an explanation of what Jesus's life on earth was all about and why it was so significant. So he went through the 4 spiritual laws with me, that little booklet, and I was struck by the truth of it. I knew that I could not reach God through all the ways that I was trying, that there was nothing that could bridge this gap between me and God, that it was instead God was bridging the gap to me through the atonement of Jesus. And I recognized it that instant, and I gave my life to the Messiah that very day, and which began the journey of my life as a Messianic Jew, as a Jewish person who believes that Jesus is the Messiah.
Wow, that's a fascinating. What are the, actually, this is probably not a good question. It's probably so basic for you, but what are the 4 spiritual laws?
Okay, well, I guess that sort of shows we're in a little different era. There's people who are my age and older who are Christians who would just immediately know exactly what that is. So the 4 spiritual laws is simply a simple, it's just a compacted gospel presentation of where we are, why we need atonement, how Jesus provided atonement, and what we need to do to access his atonement for us. So it's very basic. It's just a few verses for each of those doctrines that are just core Christian doctrines. But it's a way to help people to, the person who's sharing their faith, it enables them to keep on track with these sort of 4 different areas. And there's just 2 or 3 verses for each one. So you sort of make sure you get those verses in, and then it allows for discussion and feedback based on what the reaction is to each of those aspects.
Oh, I like that. So I like how you phrase it with where, why, how, and what. So we have big questions and in phrasing them a little bit differently. So that's interesting. I think that's fascinating. So you weren't, see, I was suspecting that Isaiah 53 is what brought you, but it sounds like you came from a completely different way from the East. I didn't think that. Did you? did you actually end up going back to the Old Testament and looking at the different passages or looking at the Jewish scriptures and tying them in with Jesus at any point?
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, it might be a common misconception that a Jewish person might have Isaiah 53 as a key part of their trek to accepting Jesus as Messiah. And that certainly, I'm sure, is for people who had someone presented to them. But oddly enough, for most Jewish people, and I mean a high percentage, there is never an encounter with Isaiah 53 ever in their life. Even if a Jewish person goes to synagogue every Friday night or Saturday for Sabbath or Shabbat services, through the cycle of synagogue readings, there would be all of the first 5 books of the Bible. And then every week there's a section from the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, whether it be from the Psalms, whether it be from the prophets, or Proverbs, other non-Torah 5 books sections, but not all of the rest of the Hebrew scriptures are gone through each year. And the Isaiah 53 passage is one that is not encountered. So every time in my life that I've shared that chapter with a Jewish person, it was for the first time. So for me, having accepted Jesus as atonement, as Messiah, as the Christ, and then to go back and see Isaiah 53, it's hard to explain what it was like. But of course, I then learned more and more of the key passages in Zechariah or Psalms or Jeremiah or Ezekiel that really help a Jewish person and anyone to understand the messianic prophecy that was filled in Jesus. And for me, it was crucial to understand. So for me, while Isaiah 53 and the other messianic passages weren't crucial in the beginning phase, they were crucial in the beginning foundation of my faith, because shortly after becoming a believer, of course, the Jewish believer starts thinking, well, wait a minute, how is it that you claim to know this truth and your rabbi or your friends or your uncle or your grandmother don't? How is that? Why would you think you have the ability to discern this when rabbis from centuries before you have not recognized it? Why would you think you are the enlightened one? But of course, going to these passages became extremely important. And then even looking at rabbis in antiquity that did also understand the messianic prophecies, and even the suffering servant passage in Isaiah, or I should say Isaiah 53, as relating to the suffering servant. Of course, not determining or attributing it to Jesus, but still understanding that it was related to the suffering servant. So for me, that was significant as a Jewish person, because I could connect to things that clearly pointed to who Jesus was and how he fulfilled messianic prophecy, even though my people at large hadn't accepted it and have not to this day.
Wow. Yeah, I'm just thinking of, because you just mentioned something that I build on. The Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin 98a pretty much talks about 2 different types of Messiah, one who's riding on an ass, and then the other one who's coming in the clouds. And so it's a reference to Zechariah, as you mentioned, 9:9, and to Daniel 7. And I think that that's obviously old. And then it's my understanding that somebody called Rashi around the year 1000, realized that Christians were using Isaiah 53 to try to bring Jewish people to Jesus. And so he sort of reframed it as describing Israel. Have you thought of any arguments against Israel, the country? And I've thought of arguments, but have you thought of any arguments that you could have, or maybe you've been telling people when they do use that interpretation that, oh wait, it's not Israel?
Well, first of all, you're bringing up some really good points that I certainly want to respond to. In terms of the Talmudic understanding of the two messiahs, Judaism had just developed more of a point of view, while in a scholarly sense, understanding that the idea of a political redeeming Messiah became more and more in the forefront of Jewish messianic expectations. Now, as far as Rashi in the 11th century, and his influence in Jewish thought, you're exactly right. Isaiah 53 was being used as a significant outreach to the Jewish people. But sadly, because of how Jewish people were treated in Europe at that time, weren't able to own land, were very had to live in their own ghetto, were taught by the church at that time that they were both, well, Augustine taught that the Jewish people had a dual nature. They were cursed because of being Christ killers, and yet they were loved by God because of a covenant relationship. So he taught that Jewish people had to be punished by Christians, but not killed. And so someone like Rashi was not exactly, he wasn't enamored by this Jesus that he was presented, because for him and my people at that time and through many centuries, they were really taught that Jesus was against them and following Jesus was against them, and Christianity was a literal threat. So Rashi did stress this Israel aspect of Isaiah 53, which, you know, if someone just reads Isaiah 53 and didn't know anything about who it's talking about, and was, let's say it was just a paragraph on an SAT, and someone said, well, is this a person that's being talked about? Is it a nation that's being talked about? It's quite obviously a person. And the difficulty with it being Israel is because Israel is mentioned in the passage. So it's illogical that Israel can both be the recipient of the suffering servant's acts and be the suffering servant. So it really takes a twist of the passage to attribute it to Israel. Now, of course, at the same time, we understand that there are aspects of Isaiah's prophecies that do relate to Israel as a nation. So it's not as if, oh, okay, all of Isaiah always talks about a personal suffering servant. No. So it is pretty complex. But this passage is clearly talking about a suffering servant Messiah. And there are other citations within, even there was a Jewish prayer book that was used in the late 1800s and early 1900s that this is in the liturgy for the Day of Atonement that talks about Isaiah 53 in terms of it relating to the suffering servant in very clear ways. So there are these cases where my people have seen it as clearly referencing the suffering servant, the Messiah, but scholars and rabbis are under tremendous pressure not to attribute it because of how it may be seen currently by the Jewish community and how it might even mesh with his or her own personal views of Jesus related to their life.
That's fascinating stuff. And so, and I think it's what's a real shame, obviously, is the treatment that Jewish people had to endure over the centuries since they were dispersed in the year 70. But what's wonderful is the way that God has worked wonders after 1,878 years, bringing Israel back in 1948. And so I think that in itself to me is miraculous, that Israel essentially is resurrected and the Jewish people were brought back from all parts of the world into Israel. So I think that there's something to be said there that I could say is almost supernatural.
Well, I would say I'll be happy to take away the almost. It is supernatural. You know, if someone were to take a picture, a video, if it existed, of Israel, say in 1935, of the land in 1935, and someone were to say that a few decades later, that this arid, sparsely populated land would become one of the major nations in the world, and that Jewish people would come from all over the world, literally all over the world. And someone might say, well, if they did come from all over the world, as the Bible prophesied, how are they going to communicate? There's Jews from Morocco. There's Jews from Russia. There's Jews from the United States. Mm-hmm. Well, someone might say, well, they could all speak Hebrew. And then someone would say, but they don't know Hebrew. And that's another amazing thing, that Hebrew was resurrected as a language. It hadn't been spoken other than in liturgy and in the synagogue for many, many centuries. And the thought that the Jewish people would come from all over the world, would learn Hebrew together, and would join as this society together, coming from totally different areas, would have been far-fetched. As a matter of fact, I want to say something related to that. In the Passover service every year, at the end of the service, the Seder, the order of the service, the meal that's the liturgical meal in the home, the last thing said is, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. And whenever I say that, when I lead a Seder, I think of someone maybe in Minsk, in Latvia in 1750, or someone in Munich in 1340, or someone in Morocco in 780. You know, all these people every year have believed that there would be this unification of the Jews in Israel. And the thought of someone in one of those places saying next year in Jerusalem and believing that God could bring it about, if somebody had heard them say it, you could see that person saying, really? You really think it's possible that God could bring the Jewish people back? Do you know what's going on in the land? You know, even when you talk about in the late 1800s with the political things going on with Arabs and fighting, and, you know, it's just not going to happen. Someone could easily say, if it happened, the Arabs would not accept it and it couldn't be. Well, they'd be right about the fact that the Arabs couldn't accept it, but it did happen, it did exist, and it is a testimony that what God says will come true. Sometimes we don't know exactly when, but it will indeed take place.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. And I had not really even thought about that until recently. And just really, I actually had another Jewish person called Prophet David on my channel, David McGuire, and he was talking about how he feels that that's a true miracle. And then I guess the Hebrew was sort of resurrected around the late 1800s when
Yes.
somebody decided to start speaking it. And so that movement, just thinking about language, is truly incredible. And I would say that certainly God has inspired. There's one thing left, though. What do you think about, we know from the prophecies of Daniel and Ezekiel and Revelation, we know that Jerusalem is the center, and the Jerusalem temple is the abomination of desolation has to appear in this Jerusalem temple, and this Jerusalem temple happens to now be located right exactly where this huge mosque is. And so, what do you make of that? What do you think is going to happen with that?
Well, that's going to be interesting. Let's put it that way. But when we think of somehow this what is going to happen in the future, and we say, well, there's a mosque there, therefore it's impossible. We just look at other miraculous situations. People could have said, well, how could the Jewish slaves in Egypt ever leave? They're so crucial to the Egyptian economy. They're never going to be let go. They're never going to go to their own land. It's impossible. They're never going to be regathered to Israel. And another thing, even in modern times, that relates to why we can believe God and we can believe what he's saying about the Jewish people and the future without knowing exactly how it's going to happen. I think of the 1967 war, when the Arab world declared war against Israel. And if you look at a map, it's really interesting to look at a map of Israel and this little country, the size of New Jersey, and we're talking about these large nations of Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran and Jordan and Lebanon and Egypt. It's an overwhelming physical view. Now, it would be one thing to say, first of all, you would look at the map and just say, it's impossible. It's impossible that this little country can survive that onslaught. But then for you to tell that person that that all of these nations were defeated in 6 days, it would seem to be an impossibility. As a matter of fact, there are stories that there were miraculous events during that time. And these stories came through people who really didn't believe in prophecy. These were widely circulated stories that Egyptian tanks that when the Israelis encountered Egyptian tanks in the Sinai Peninsula, they would see empty tanks. And they would find out through intelligence that these Egyptian tank drivers saw millions of soldiers and artillery and material coming at them, and just manifestations that so frightened them that they just left the tanks and vanished. And but in one sense, it almost would have to be something like that for all of these armies not to be successful in crushing Israel. It seems literally impossible that Israel could defend even one border. Even if you look at Israel against Egypt at that time, or against Syria or Lebanon, it would have been impossible especially now Israel is a very sophisticated military power. But back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, when it was attacked, it was really a burgeoning new state that really was ripe to be overrun. But God did not allow it to happen.
Wow, that is absolutely fascinating. I never heard about any of those stories, so I'm going to try to look into even more on that. Because is there a place that you can go that tracks that kind of thing, that would have tracked 1967, or
I do
where'd you learn
have
that?
I do have some citations. I don't have them off the tip of my
Okay.
tongue, but I will certainly provide them for you,
Oh, good. Yeah.
so you can share them.
It's really fascinating. And so, yeah, I do think something probably miraculous will happen. And it's interesting because I've even heard talk of the third temple. Yeah, I've heard talking. I saw a YouTube video with Netanyahu saying something about a third temple. So I know that there's mutterings. I don't want to get to the end of the world, but I know that there are these mutterings.
Yes, yes, and yeah, someone like it to say that it's controversial to talk about a third temple would be probably the greatest understatement, because the Islamic world has such concern about any resurgence of Jewish territorial rights over the Temple Mount that it really is amazing when you think about it, that Jewish people today are not allowed to pray where the second temple stood.
Really?
Really.
They,
Jewish people are
huh.
allowed by the Jordanian authorities to walk on it, but they may not pray. And if there's any indication that they're reading a prayer book or are engaged in prayer, they will be removed.
Wow.
So, which is
It seems kind
amazing
of
because,
paranoid.
well, but see, it's part of this whole fear that I think the Islamic world and the Jordanian Authority in specific really know that one day Israel could say, we're taking it over. This is the central point in our history. This is the place where our God met with our people in a incredible manifestation, and we're allowing you to keep your mosque here. But there are many people in Israel that really want to see that ended, and there's a constant tension over it. As a matter of fact, when the nation recaptured Jerusalem in 1967, there was a tremendous divide about whether the Temple Mount should be captured. And of course, many Jewish people to this day will say it should have happened, but others will say, no, if it had happened, there never could have been a ceasefire. There never would have been any kind of peace with the Islamic neighbors or any of the Arab neighbors. So it was deemed that we cannot do it. And there's really a picture of the great Israeli general Moshe Dayan right at the wall. And they're really contemplating, should we do this or not? Really a poignant moment in history.
Wow. Yeah, that's extremely fascinating. And I one day I've never been to Israel, but one day I definitely would like to go over there and see all that. Have you been to Israel?
I have. I had the great joy of spending an entire summer in Israel. I went to Israel. I studied at Hebrew University. I simply went to learn Hebrew. I was going to be involved in an organization at that time that was witnessing to my people. And I really felt that a more extensive Hebrew background would be important for me. And I wanted to become more understanding of my own Jewish roots. So in terms of what you said about that you'd love to go to Israel, I cannot urge you enough. All of us who believe in Jesus, our faith it's sort of in our mind. I'm not saying it's not real, but it's in our mind, and it's based on a real relationship with Jesus. It's real. It's based on what we've read in the Bible, what we've heard from other people. So it's sort of a mental thing. I'm trying not to diminish the reality of it. Forgive me, but I think you'll understand the point I'm trying to make, although inarticulately. When you actually go to Israel and go to biblical sites, there's something about the integration of what you believe with the physicality of it that is of a profound nature that no one can really express it until they've experienced it. And it's a wonderful thing. I guess anything I say now will sort of be anticlimactic from that, but I encourage you and all who see this to try to plan to go there. Israel is a very, very safe country. Israel makes incredible precautions for tourists to be safe. I guarantee you there's many places in the United States that are less safe than Israel. And if that safety factor is keeping you back, because I know sometimes it is, I want to let you know you don't have to worry about it. And that if you hear of a tour or you hear some friends going, I urge you to go. And I promise you, you won't come back and say, Rob, that was really a waste of my time and money. I know you won't be telling me that.
Yeah, to be able to walk, go to the Mount of Olives and go to these different places, I think it would be extremely fascinating, the Western Wall. And I mean, I had a dream I was there. It was funny because I've seen it. I have seen it. I've seen pictures of it. I've actually bought a National Geographic just to look at the pictures of Israel. And then I had this dream. It's like my mind's putting it together saying, you need to go here. I had a dream I was there. So one day maybe I'll be able to go. And yes, you're right. It is a safety issue, but just because of our gun issues here, I actually believe you. I could say that as far as that, we have such issues over here that it could be even more unsafe here. So that's an interesting way to think about it.
It's simply safe. I mean, you might hear of skirmishes on the Israeli border, but Israel has really figured out security really well. And they know that one tourist death could so affect their tourism, which is so significant to them, that there is a lot going on that you will never see to make sure that tourists are safe.
Wow, that's great. I have my friend from my university, who's my Jewish friend. She's been there a few times, and she's funny. She actually brought me some things from there. One of them was a really cute wooden cross it's nice because she supports my Christianity. I support her Jewish faith. And it's just, we sometimes have conversations and I'm trying to, as I like to talk to people like you, because I see somebody who you've been brought into Christianity. Obviously Jesus brought you to Christianity. It's one of those things where you say, my child hears my voice, or my sheep hear my voice. And you heard it when you were in college, which is really great. What was I going to ask you? I had another question that I thought was, what about your family? Have your family members come to believe in Jesus, or have people just retained the Jewish faith?
Well, when I first became a believer, and I was at the University of Connecticut, I would go home. This is after I told my parents of my new faith. My mother couldn't talk to me. She just literally would cry. She just would cry. And I had a conversation with my father, of whom, may he rest in peace, I was very, very close with him. I was his only son. We were in business together. We used to love to play golf together. We spent a lot of time together. So for him, excuse me, to look at me one day and say, you are a traitor to my father and my father's father, was a moment that I wouldn't want anyone to ever have to go through. Now, I will say that over the years after that, the relationship between my father and I was repaired to a certain degree, but my having come to faith did always remain to be a wedge between me and my parents and even my sisters. As a matter of fact, I was unable, even though I prayed about it and wanted it to happen many times, I was unable to have the opportunity to actually share my faith with either of my sisters for 40 years.
Hmm.
It took 40 years from the time I became a believer to a point in each of their lives that they were going through something, and they just let me know that they were going to allow me to talk about it. But so no, there has not been, they have not accepted the Messiah. But for both of my sisters, there's been greater openness to it. One of my sisters came to a Messianic service that I was part of and heard the good news presented in a very poignant way. As a matter of fact, the sermon was on Isaiah 53, and that has allowed some real dialogue. So I do ask for prayer for my sisters that that time that we had, each of us, that we would have another opportunity to continue that dialogue.
That is fascinating. And, you know, you speak to it kind of as a fulfilled prophecy when Jesus says your parents might hate, you might have to leave your parents, you might have to leave your brothers and sisters, people, because of choosing Jesus. And you see that played out when people leave their other faiths. Like Nabil Qureshi had a very hard time leaving the Muslim faith because, again, it was an insult to he felt it was an insult to his parents. And so it's just really interesting. So yeah, everybody, if you're in the audience, please say some prayers for his sisters. I could use some prayers too for some of my family. I've got an agnostic brother, so I'm still trying to work on him, but hopefully that'll change. I wanted to ask you.
But if I may for a moment, just to stay on that tack about the challenge of when your family may reject you, it was a significant point in my life as a young believer. I did have to choose between my family. When I say my family, I also mean my extended family. There were certain aunts and uncles and especially one grandmother that I was very close to. And I knew I was in some way severing my relationship with them. I was severing the support and love and acceptance that I was gaining from them. And it was an important part of my life. And I knew I was rejecting that. I was casting that aside. But there is a positive aspect of that happening, because when you're forced to make that decision, your faith cannot be a middle of the road thing. You can't just say, well, I'm sort of a follower of the Messiah. I'm sort of it, No, you know that you have made a decision, and therefore, by making that clear choice, it did propel me to want to be involved in discipleship activities within Campus Crusade at that time, which is now called Cru, and did help me to understand that if I was to fully go that way, I had to be all in. And I think that was a key part of a solid foundation of my faith walk.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think you're right. Building that solid foundation a lot of times does come with some adversity and some challenges. And I think my faith walk's been built by encountering a lot of atheists on social media, because I wanted to I've strengthened my faith in trying to answer their questions. And I think that sounds like something that you might be doing as well. And let's get to your book. Actually, I want to ask you one quick question before your book. So what percentage would you say, or maybe you don't know this, you probably do know this because you seem to know a lot of stuff, and is the entire Jewish populace made up of people who believe in Jesus? Do you have any idea on that?
I don't know the percentage. I do know numbers. It's estimated that there are about 100,000 Jewish followers of Jesus in the United States. But really interestingly, there's at least about 25,000 in Israel. And there is a serious development in Israel of Jewish followers of Jesus. This really is a phenomenon that has really taken place, interestingly enough, since the late 60s. We're talking about 67. This movement of Jewish people returning to the God of Israel through the promised Messiah, it has been a resurgence only in the last few decades. And part of that has been involved in congregations, Messianic congregations, where Jesus is preached, but the service has a Jewish flavor, has Jewish holiday aspects to it. So a Jewish person coming into it won't feel that they have to lose their identity as a Jewish person to accept the Messiah, but that it's a natural thing for a Jewish person to accept the Messiah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Those are interesting numbers. I'm trying to find, I have a question here from somebody in the audience who goes by Stripper Liquor. Question for guests: did the family tie severing involve any type of shunning? If so, is that a common Jewish practice?
I think the shunning is something that would take place in an extreme Orthodox community, especially a Hasidic, a certain separatist sort of Orthodox community, that that shunning might even take place even if the Jewish person didn't go all to Messianic faith, but even a form of Judaism that didn't observe the Sabbath fully, thoroughly, entirely. But that shunning is rare. It would be really more among a very Orthodox, when I say Orthodox, I'm referring to the extremely observant to every detail of the law, and of course, even beyond that, to rabbinic understandings of some of the smaller aspects of what are seen as Jewish observance. So I know it's often hard for people to hear of the kind of Jewish community, to sort of get a handle on how can it be that your parents weren't religious. In other words, they didn't keep the Sabbath, and yet this faith became such a breach. Another example of it is, even though my father wasn't observant, he did not allow me to date anyone who was not Jewish. So there was this strong familial tie, national tie, ethnic tie that was beyond or existed without the religious observant component. I know it's sometimes hard to understand Jewish life as ethnic, national, peoplehood, religion. It's so complex and different in that way, but that is part of the environment I grew up in.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I think I know the audience is going to like to hear your book. And this is like a nice little surprise at the end, because I love what you told me, the little bit you told me about it already. So would you like to share that?
Well, it is in process, so I can't hold it up. The book is, the title is 5 Things Jewish People Don't Know About Jesus. And then in parentheses, and most Christians don't either. That book is really going to be a combination of things that Jewish people don't know, and often things that Christians have forgotten over the years about the Jewish roots of their faith. And that's something to really get into over a period of time. Maybe we can do that at another time, because that would bringing up that subject, it would be hard for me to really be concise about it. But
Yeah.
I'll give you a little tidbit. Getting back to the Talmud has some fascinating things to say about what happened around the year 70 or just prior to it. Of course, the temple was destroyed, but we're talking about the period just before the destruction of the temple. One of the things is, it says that for about 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple, the huge, massive temple doors would open of their own accord.
Wow.
Every day, these massive, huge stone doors that it took many people to open and close would open on their own accord, and even when they were closed, they would open again. And of course, 40 years before the destruction of the temple was the atonement of the Messiah, was the death and resurrection of the Messiah, which showed that his atonement was accepted. And I believe that the opening of those temple doors was another physical way of God telling us all his atonement was accepted. You need not enter the temple for atonement. The high priest no longer has to enter the temple for atonement on Yom Kippur. But the fact that it's mentioned in the sacred Jewish writings that it took place for 40 years, and there's other events like that happened supernaturally that are written about for the 40-year period from about 30 to 70, are really things that most Christians and most Jews do not know. So it really is a great desire of mine to get that information out.
Wow. Yeah, you make me want to go read the Talmud now. I've only read little bits and pieces of it, so I had to go back and look at that. That sounds fascinating.
Yes, I'll get you the citations and you can share them with your audience, exactly the citations and the passages about that period that are really miraculous.
Yeah, there is something. There's something in symbolism a little bit when they talk about the veil being broken, or the veil coming up. Because I think that there was. It goes back. I'm just gonna throw some idea at you. It goes back to the time of before Jesus came, that people, they kind of had expectations of Jesus, but they were, when he came suddenly in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus, people's eyes were open, and it's like the veil was opened or renewed. And I think that there's something about that with the opening of the eyes that happens with the Holy Spirit. And so have you ever thought about the veil of the temple or any of those kind of things?
Well, the ripping of the veil of the temple does have great significance. And I do like your take on it in terms of that symbolic veil. That's really thought-provoking. But even the literal aspect that happened, I don't have the exact dimensions to say, but it's worth everyone who's viewing this to look it up. Look up the size, width, and weight of this curtain. So when we hear the words, the curtain was torn, for us, a curtain might be the living room curtain. Well, okay, yeah, that's pretty cool. But this curtain was inches thick, was huge and heavy. And I mean, I know in one sense it doesn't matter how big it was. A miracle is a miracle. But if someone saw this rend in two, it would be so clearly a miraculous event. There would be no way of it having any human cause any way that it could happen other than in a miraculous way. And of course, once again, sort of connecting with those doors opening, the split of the curtain so poignantly shows that access to God has been granted to us, not just through the high priest once a year, but he has a way for us to enter the holy holies of holies, symbolically, of course, but in terms of atonement and truth, at any time for any person, and importantly, Jew or Gentile.
Yeah, really, really fascinating. I didn't realize the curtain was that thick, but it speaks to when that Roman soldier, when the earthquake occurred, when Jesus, tasted death, essentially, when the earthquake occurred and the curtain was torn. That's why the Roman soldier said, surely he is the Messiah. And because that passage, sometimes people think, well, why would he just all of a sudden say, surely he's the Messiah? It must be because of the supernatural events and then the earthquake, but then the ripping of the temple and that sort of thing that must have been, that must have been part of it. Have you ever thought of any of those
Yes, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so
absolutely right.
That's really interesting. I would love to have you back on sometime to talk about some other ideas from your book that you're working on.
I would love to do that. I'll bring up the other aspects other than the doors opening that are part of signs that show that the atonement was indeed accepted. And maybe you'll have some questions that will come in. That people can ask that I would really be happy to answer. Anything about my life growing up, what it's like to be a Jewish believer in Jesus, I'd really be happy. How to witness to a Jewish neighbor, friend. I would really love to get into that.
Yeah, I have to say, I did go to one of my Jewish colleague. I went to her one day and I said, have you read Isaiah 53? And she said, yes, it's Israel. She's like, and then I just turned around.
Well, of course, your colleague is I imagine she has at least one graduate degree and, is sophisticated in her.
Is.
Right. But so I'm not too shocked there, but I really think that if you did survey 1,000 Jewish people, if you were at a sporting event, and you surveyed 100 Jewish people, I would say somewhere in the 90s would never have read Isaiah 53.
Wow.
I really believe less than 10 of the 100 would have.
That's fascinating. I want to share something that I discovered that I think is kind of interesting too. I was looking at the timing of Ramadan versus the timing of the Yom Kippur. And both of these are times when God has called on people to fast. And Ramadan is a 30-day period that's always in the summer. And it's always at a time because it's the summer, it's always at a time where in the Northern Hemisphere, in the northernmost places, you cannot, they don't have sunset because the sun is up in sight all day long, 24 hours. And so to be able to fast from sunrise to sunset is very difficult unless you just look at times instead and say, I'm going to ignore the fact that the sun's up. But Yom Kippur comes at a time when the unique time on the planet, when no matter where you are, there's a sunrise and a sunset. And I think that's sort of supernatural.
Well, that's a very interesting astronomical aspect that I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think there's so many great things about the Bible and about and understanding the rabbinic roots of Jesus. I think that's so important because some people have guesstimated that he might have been part of, he might have been a Pharisee himself. He was certainly teaching people in the temple. And so I think that the church, unfortunately, has gone to strains over the years, over the centuries, especially back in the beginning, maybe in the 400s and 500s, to try to remove the Jewishness of Jesus. But there's some truly fascinating stuff where you can better understand, like, for example, why did the Pharisees get so crazy and start ripping their garments in Mark 14:62, when Jesus said, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. It's because they knew exactly what that meant. The Son of Man had significance to them, even more so than him saying Son of God. And so So I just think that people need to look into the Jewishness of Jesus. And I know that that's kind of the stuff that you're doing.
Well, there's no question. And when I come back, I would really love to address that. And it's of great interest to me. And I really love expressing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. So anyway, I guess we can close up. Do you have is there a place where people can find you? I know I found you on Twitter, but how can people find you?
Well, I should have a place where they can find me. But I happen to be in transition in my social media account. So I will let you know that as soon as I make that transition, because I really want people to be able to contact me and ask me questions directly. So I really would be happy to do that. I will let you know very shortly. As I say, someone else was claiming it's a complex thing, and I'm in the midst of working it out, and I'll let you know where that is. And I really want very much to be open and accessible to people, and I look forward to it very much.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. Yeah. So I'll go ahead as soon as I get that from you. I'll put that in the description so people can find you if they happen to watch this later.
Great.
And that's just wonderful. So thank you so much, Rob, for coming on. I appreciate all of your knowledge and your insights.
Well, it's truly my pleasure. There's really nothing I'd rather do than be able to tell of how God brought me to himself. And it is such an honor and a privilege to have been plucked out of my people and to be part of this remnant of those who are continuing in the biblical story through following Jesus as Messiah. So I think you could probably tell that I enjoy it. And if it gives God glory and it can help people in their faith, then that would bring me great joy.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. And thank you to everybody in the audience who's watching this, or if you watch it in the future, thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. So stick around for just a sec, Rob. I'll say thank you again. So.